All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Jack Trenhaile. It's September 10th, 2025. We're at Jack's home in Newburgh. Jack, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
First question is, why wine?
It was partly kind of preparation or fate, and part accident. And it didn't really start as wine. It started as grapes. And maybe it returned to grapes, by the end. There was a wine stint in the middle. We were living in McMinnville, Oregon. We had a small farm of 30 acres on a dry, rocky hillside. And on weekends, I was helping a neighbor farmer plant his wheat.
What year was this around?
This was 1975. And we finished up. It was on the weekend. He said to me, "Oh, did you hear that so-and-so who works for the vineyard up on the hill is leaving?" And I said, "Well, I didn't know this person. And I didn't even know there was a vineyard up there." He said, but I said, "Well, yeah, that's neat. I kind of like that idea." He said, "Well, I'll take you up and introduce you to the people who were there." So he did, and I went up and I met two of the owners, Bill Welch and Victor Kreimeier. And Bill had to leave, but Vic took me on a tour of the vineyard, and we talked about things. And I had some time. I knew I was going to have some time the next year, so I said, I would be interested in some part-time work in the vineyard. And I think I said something about in the spring or summer. And Vic pointed out to me that, well, the weather was pretty nice in Western Oregon, and so you could work all winter. So that was kind of a new idea for me, to. And then, and we talked a little bit about the person who was leaving, and Vic said, "Well, we're going to try to convince him to stay this next year." So I went home and I thought about it. This is kind of interesting. And so I called up. One of them had given me their phone number, and I called them up, and they said, "Oh no, we're going to do everything we can to get this guy to come back. We liked him." And I thought, well, I wonder who. So I found out who he was and where he lived, and I went to visit him. And I tried not to be too intrusive, but I asked him if they had convinced him to come back, and he said no, they did not. But it was a good place to work. If it wasn't a good place to work, I wouldn't have stayed the whole year, which I thought was another expression that was kind of good. Anyway, this guy and I became lifelong friends. He was okay. So I called them back. They said, well, they thought one of the family members was going to manage the vineyard, take care of the vineyard. So I said, well, that's on. I went on to other things. And about a month later, I got a phone call, and the family member didn't work out. So they asked me if I would like to come to work, January 3rd, 1976. And I said yes. And we negotiated a salary. It wasn't much. And the number of days, the days of the week that I would go because all of the owners had other careers, and they would come out on the weekend. So they wanted any employees to be there on the weekends with them. Well, I didn't want to work both days of the weekend because Diane had a full-time job during the week, and we would never have any time to do anything together, during the days. So I think I agreed to work weekends for the first month, and so I could be there and we would get to know each other, and then after that I worked. I had one day off on the weekends, and that's kind of how it happened. And it went on to be, I was there for 31 years.
That's amazing.
And maybe this is a good time to say that, I started out, well, I do have to tell this story. The first day, we were pruning 3 or 4 year old vines, and Bill Welch and I. And Bill had invited Dick Erath, who had, learned to prune the year before, or 2 years before that. It was, people would learn something, and at that time, 1 year, and they would teach somebody else the next year. And it was quite, that happened a lot. And so Dick came out and spent a couple hours with us pruning, and we pruned that day. The next day, we built trellis. And then Bill went back to Portland, and here I was, with two days of experience in the middle of a 40-acre vineyard. That was, in the oldest vines would have been 4 years, and the youngest 2 years old. And you've probably seen the movie with Sally Field picking cotton, and there's this huge field, and the camera pans out, and she's out there in the middle of the field by herself. Or there's another one, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. They're digging turnips, and they're out in the middle of this muddy field. Well, that was kind of how it felt at times, being out there by myself. But I did. I pruned grapes every day for weeks. And they would come on weekends, and it was. I really looked forward to them coming on Saturday. That there was some company up there. Some days you couldn't see the valley. Sometimes the fog, especially around McMinnville. But we were at high enough elevation that you would be up out of the fog, but you'd look out and you see nothing but these clouds below you. And then, of course, there were other days that you were in the fog, and you couldn't see the valley then either. So, the nearest neighbor was about a mile. There was no electricity, no telephone, and no running water. And I don't know that this is a lot different from many other vineyards that got started in Oregon. But, that's what it was. And
amazing. We'll come back and pick that up in a minute. Let's talk a little bit about life before that. So tell us about where you were born and raised, and kind of your path to having a farm in McMinnville.
Well, I've actually written this down some time ago when I was trying to be clever, but I was born in a farmhouse on the edge of nowhere, in northeast Nebraska.
It is the edge of nowhere.
And near a little town called Lindy. I was told by my family it was a stormy night, and my mother couldn't go to the hospital because the bridge had washed out. So the doctor had to come to us, and my father took the wagon. And whether he took horses with the wagon, this was 1944, horses with a wagon, or he had a truck, or he had a pickup, or a car, or however, but he put planks on the wagon and went down, laid it across the creek that had washed out the bridge, and the doctor walked across the creek, and then he brought the doctor to our house. And is that all true? I don't know. Anyway, but it made a great story. When I was 5 years old, we moved to the family farm. We were not living on the family farm then, but my father bought his father's farm that had been homesteaded by his grandfather. My great-great-grandfather. And there we had, I don't know if I said, but the house we lived in before had no electricity and no plumbing and something else it didn't have. I think we had kerosene lamps and something like that. So anyway, we moved to a house that had electricity and running water, but like a kitchen pump and so forth. And I went to elementary school, to a one-room schoolhouse. There were about 20 kids. There were 5 of us were in one class. So there were 3 girls and 2 boys. And the boy moved away by about 2nd grade, and I never saw him again. But I've seen the 3 girls over the years, you know, and we have photos every 10 or 15 years. So, I think the last one was maybe 5 years ago or something like that. But they're all still around. And then to go to high school, it was a 10-mile bus ride on gravel roads. And I graduated from high school in 1962. I joined the Air Force in that summer. I had had enough of farm life by then, and living in the edge of nowhere. And two significant things happened there. One was the Air Force sent me to Bermuda, and I fell in love with the ocean. And I met Diane there. So I had two loves. Yeah. And we got married the next year. This was a few years later when we met, after I was there, and moved to Florida. The Air Force sent me to Florida, and when my tour with the Air Force was over, I went to junior college for 2 years, and then it was time to go somewhere else, and I ended up at the University of Hawaii. I decided that wherever I was going to go to school, it was going to be close to the ocean. And Hawaii accepted me first, and we went. So we got rid of everything that we owned, which wasn't a whole lot at that time, and drove across country to California, put our car on a boat, and got on the airplane, and flew to Honolulu.
What year?
1968. And I started in political science. Well, it became obvious to me after one semester that was not really what I wanted wanted to study. I was very interested in writing, in creative writing, and I had done some of that in Florida at the junior college, and so I was thinking that I could do political science and creative writing. And when you think about it today, that's not too far-fetched that those two careers could. There's a lot of creativity in politics. So, but anyway, the political part didn't work out, so I needed to transfer to something else, and I decided, well, it's writing, it's English, so I'll study English. But I also needed to work some. Hawaii was very expensive, and Diane was working, but still, it was. We needed to do that, and I got a job with Honolulu Bookshops. They had 3 stores, and over the next 4 years, I kind of worked my way up. After, I don't know, maybe a year, I went to manage the Waikiki branch. It was a small one-person shop, so you did everything. You managed yourself. But we did have two employees on the evenings and weekends. And then after about a year there, the person who was managing the downtown store left, and so I went there for the last 2 or 3 years. And that was maybe a five-person store. And it was a really good experience. I learned a lot there, and but in the meantime, our daughter was born in 1971. We bought a house in about 1970. In a suburb of Honolulu. And I started growing things in the backyard. Just, tomatoes and mangoes, papayas, avocados, all those kind of things. And we got the idea that we would start a farm in Hawaii. So we looked, we really liked the island of Kauai. So we even got as far as, we put together what the Chinese called a hui. It was a group of friends, and we offered to buy like 60 acres or something on the island of Kauai. Well, it was expensive. And it was just too expensive, and they wouldn't negotiate with us, so we didn't do that. We thought about starting a bookstore on the island of Kauai, and we even made a few visits there, looked it over, and it's probably best that neither one of those happened. And looking back at what we've learned since, I think it would have been a really difficult. It would be surprising if we would have been successful in either one of them. So in 1973, we sold our house, left the bookstore, and we came to Oregon. We had friends that we met in Hawaii who would come to Oregon that summer. And so we came and visited them, and we bought a Toyota Hilux pickup, and we spent the next month touring Oregon and Washington. We went up the Washington coast because we wanted to live close to the ocean. And then we went all the way to Mount. What's the one, the farthest north? And Mount Baker. Went up to Mount Baker. And then we crossed over and came down the east side from Yakima to Warm Springs, all the way to Klamath Falls, over to the Oregon coast, and came back up with our then 2-year-old daughter. Prior to doing that, one day we drove up to Seattle to Recreation Equipment, and we bought tent, sleeping bags, boots, backpacks, and so we camped out along the way. We hiked, but we also stayed in motels. On the way back up, we were in Bandon or Brookings, one of those places in Oregon, and this would have been September, October, maybe September. But it rained and the wind blew, and we thought, oh, what have we done? It was cold. We just weren't used to that. But anyway, we came on back. We spent a few more days with our friends, and then we decided that we had no house, we had no jobs, but we had this pickup, and so we decided we were going to go on another trip. So we went and visited my family in Nebraska. Diane's mother, who lives in New Jersey, came to meet us, and then we visited some of Diane's family in Missouri, near St. Louis. Back to California, I had an older brother there, and friends in Berkeley who we'd met in Hawaii. Back to Oregon. And that December, we bought the 30 acres near McMinnville. We raised rabbits, elephant garlic, and sheep. That was what we started out doing. We had intentions to doing other things, but the soil and the water just there wasn't enough of either one, so they didn't work. But the garlic was like wheat. You planted it in the fall and you harvest it in the summer, and so it was a good crop for Oregon. And that was most of the responsibility for that. Eventually fell to Diane, but we had as much as 20 tons one year. It was our biggest crop ever. And then, we came around and I got involved in the vineyard. And
after touring that many places and looking, why did you choose the spot you did, and why did you choose to do farming versus other things you could have done?
Well, I think before we left Hawaii, I knew that I wanted to grow something, and I didn't want to grow what everybody else was growing. I didn't want to go back to Nebraska and raise corn, oats, and alfalfa, which is, a field. It's what there was. Oregon had wheat, grass seed. And the other things, maybe a few other things, but that's what you saw out there. You looked, and it was wheat and grass seed, and that didn't appeal to me. And I think we had always been a bit, contrary in things. Most people would wait. Well, people that I grew up with never went to Hawaii, but people in New Jersey, where Diane was from, they would. Well, when they retired, they would go to Hawaii, and we said, why wait till we retire? Let's go now. So we did, and I think it was on that backyard in Hawaii that I decided I was going to grow something, and accidentally found grapes. And we weren't.
Back to the land time.
Yeah, it was a back to the land time. And it was kind of interesting because I think the owners of Hyland at that time, who were 25 years older than me, maybe more, some of them, in a way they were kind of back to the land. You know. We were more hippie-ish than they were. That wasn't a term you would use to describe them.
So you had a history of growing things, and you had an interest in growing things. So tell me about grapes and getting to understand what was unique about them, what you needed to learn in order to manage this vineyard.
Well, I think I learned early on that grapes were fairly easy to grow, but it was very hard to get grapes that made good wine. It seemed like there was another plant that was like that. It was fairly easy, because I mean, you make a grape cutting and you stick it in the ground and you have a plant. This was pre-phylloxera time, and so that wasn't a consideration. But over those first 3 years, from 76 to 79, there was a lot of reading. The industry. The people in the industry were very helpful. We had regular monthly meetings at the Tigard Fire Hall. I'm sure someone has talked about that. And there was Grape Day in Aurora. There was some other thing in Corvallis. There was some socializing. Sometimes that was great talk. But mainly you spent your time out there and you observed and thought about it and said, let's try this, let's try that. When the vineyard was planted, initially, they planted, the first year in 72, they planted about 10 different varieties. The major ones were Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Riesling, and Müller-Thurgau, but there were a bunch of others because, I mean, there may have been some people who knew, but the people who planted Hyland, I mean, that they didn't know. We just didn't know. And so, what was your question again?
About learning. Yeah. So tell me about the big parts for you of learning the job, learning the sort of the cycle of the year. How did you get a grasp on what you had to be doing each time of the year to get the grapes you wanted?
Well, first of all, we didn't know what kind of grapes we wanted. I don't think we did. I don't think there may have been some people who approached this in the beginning as, I want to make wine. Well, in order to do that, I need some grapes, so I'm going to do that. Well, I didn't want to make wine, so I didn't approach it like that. We knew the grapes were going to start to grow about the middle of April. So by the middle of March, we better have everything done to do that. And there were three major things you had to do. And you had to prune them, you had to get rid of the old brush off of the vine, and you had to tie them up. And so if you had if you were done with that by the end of March, well, you'd made the first thing. And then there were various things you sprayed. In the early days, we did this and we did that, and then we found out we didn't really need to do that, but you needed to do something else that we weren't doing. And I could probably, come up with what those things are, but it was 50 years ago, so I don't. And then for the next 3 months, you just they grew, and in the beginning, we chased them every summer to try to get all these shoots to stand up and forth, and we devised various ways of helping us do that. Catch wires, and I think I invented a catch wire hanger, and I was inspired by a coat hanger, but we made them out of number 9 wire, and a friend of mine, the same friend who I had stalked at his house to learn about the vineyard, he was good at making things, and so we would talk about stuff, and his name is Jamie Tombaugh, by the way, and I can't believe that 900 people, someone hasn't mentioned him before, but anyway. We made various tools and jigs and things to allow us to bend these wires into shape. And we'd hang them on the posts, and we'd hang the catch wires there. So when the grapes grew up between them, we just pushed them in, and it saved a lot of time and fewer broken shoots and all that stuff. And eventually it was modified, and I think today, if they still use them, but at one time you could go to Oregon Vineyard Supply and buy them. So we didn't get any royalties. So, but that was good. Back to learning. I read General Viticulture. I think it might be on the shelf, but no, I think it's in the office. And I'm not sure I would have done very well on a test on it, but we did. And then in the fall, as the grapes started to ripen, birds were a big problem in the beginning. We chased birds, it seemed like, for months. And originally we sold the grapes to Tualatin Winery in Forest Grove. And there were 2 of us. I had a helper. We picked into small wooden lugs boxes. I think they were old prune boxes. They weighed almost as much as the grapes you put in them. So they were really heavy. But we'd pick for 2 days. We could pick half a truckload the first day, and we'd pick the second half the next day. And then that evening I would drive them in an old Ford 1-ton truck that would, maybe go 40 miles an hour up to Tualatin, and get home about midnight, 1 in the morning after dumping. We'd stem and crush the grapes right off the truck. Bill Fuller was standing by the crusher, and I would hand him the boxes. And I think he would have appreciated had we been there a little earlier in the day, but that's what we did at that time. And then we'd come back, and the next morning we'd start on another truckload, and we didn't have a huge amount of grapes, but at 2 tons a time, we probably had 20 tons that year. It took a while. And I think all the grapes went to Tualatin those first 2 years. And then in 1978, Schoolhouse started. And in the years preceding that, the Hyland folks and the Blossers and one other vineyard had talked about starting a winery together. And I don't know all the details about that, but other than that idea was around. But it came time that I think the Blossers were ready to start, and Hyland and the other person, they weren't ready. And so the Blossers went on without us. But they were in need of grapes. So we switched from Tualatin, and I believe we sold all the grapes to Schoolhouse. But only for a year or two, because we had too many. They didn't. Their vineyards were coming on. They had a neighbor to them, the Durants, that they also got grapes from, and so we started looking for other buyers. And then, where are we? We're in 1978. Oh, and then 1979 came. We had big crop. I think we had close to 100 tons of fruit that year. Beautiful weather, beautiful year. The fruit was ripe, overcropped, way overcropped. This was before we dealt with the idea of fruit thinning, and we were using local folks who lived in the area as pickers, and we worked ourselves up. We had 24 people. There were 24 total of us on the crew, including the owners and their families and neighbors and everyone. There were 24, and we had picked everything but the Riesling, and this would have been late October. And in those days, we didn't have the luxury of picking grapes in September. The harvest would start the second week in October, almost for anything, and we'd be right up against it in the early November, finishing up. But we started picking Riesling, and one afternoon it started to rain. It just rained and rained and rained. It rained so much we couldn't get the totes of grapes out of the vineyard. It was too steep where we were working, and so I like to think we covered them for the night to deal with, but maybe we didn't. The next morning we took 5 people, and 3 of them with shovels, and they put under the front edge of the tote to hold them up out of the mud, and the other 2, and we pushed them down the hill to the flat so we could get the tractor to them to bring them out in the truck and take them to the winery. But and we didn't pick for a few days again because it just rained and rained and rained. And finally, when we got started up again, there were 8 of us, and that's all we could find. There was no one else. The other 16 people said, "Pick in the rain? No, we're not. We're just not going to do that." And I believe the next year was the first year we had a contract crew. We just decided, because we didn't have as much fruit, but that was the future. So we did that. It seemed like there was something else significant about the 1979 year. Oh, we ended up having 7 inches of rain before we finished picking the Riesling. But I think they made wine. It sold for about the same price as it had all along. But that was a year that stood out. But also in 79, in 80, we planted another 20 acres.
What was that process like?
We prepared the ground the year before, got everything. Most of Hyland had been the original part had been orchards at one time. The name was Hyland Orchards, and on the what are they, plat maps. They say Hyland Orchards on it from 1910. And I don't know if there were still orchards there on some of it when the original plantings were made. I don't know. But all plantings after that they were wheat fields and grass fields and so forth. There may have been some cleanup around the edges and so forth. But the year before, we prepared the ground and built a deer fence around it. There were 25, 50 deer right around the vineyard, and you need it. Otherwise they would eat it all. And so the first year, built a deer fence and get the ground ready, and then the next spring we would lay out the vineyard, which was we used various methods over the years, but in the beginning it was a tape measure and pegs. You get the row started maybe against the fence line and use a compass to get the direction and so forth, and you just line up, and when you got that row right, then you measured from that row to everything else. And sometimes you had to make corrections otherwise as you moved across, the row would start to go like this, so forth. But actually 2 years before that you had to start, because you needed plants. Or 1 year. Sometimes 1 year. You could make cuttings one spring and you would get plants the next, but sometimes you needed 2 years for some reason. Can't remember why that was. And then you would either use a shovel to dig the hole, or you'd use an auger, or we bought a Christmas tree planter. And it was a little one row thing we rode on. And there we didn't put a stake where each plant went. We used wood lath, spaced every 100 feet or something in a row down the hill. We put a piece we had this front thing that came on. We had bought a new German tractor called a holder, but it had this part that stuck up on the front, and we put a piece of tape on there, and we used that for a sight. And we used a cord, some kind of sailor line. Bill Welch was a sailor. He had a sailboat, and he'd sailed to Hawaii and raced and so forth. And he knew about rope and so forth, or cord, and we marked it every. I think we were going to do 6 feet between the rows, so we marked it every 6 feet. What we didn't take into account was the cord was stretched a little bit, so the first row didn't have the same number of plants as the second one, and they didn't line up. But anyway, we figured that out, and so we ignored the first row and made sure we tied the cord off in the same place each time, and then you'd load up the machine. One person would sit on it, and it would open the furrow, and as the mark on the cord came by, you would just stick the plant there and go on down the hill. And then people would come by with milk cartons. I'm sure some people have talked about milk cartons. And they would put cartons around them they helped the plant grow a little bit, and you could water. We'll put water in there. And then, once that was done, the rest of the year was watering and keeping the weeds down a little bit and mowing. And then usually we tried in the second year to build a trellis and at least get 1 or 2 wires up. The next planting we did after that, we went back to planting with augers, but we used a tractor to mark the rows, and I built. It was just a very long pipe or a long frame with small shovels on it that were the spacing we wanted for this way, and so we'd mark all the rows north and south that were the row directions, and then for where the plants would go, I moved the shovels to the correct spacing and drove the opposite way. It worked out amazingly well. And then shortly after that, people started using GPS. We never did. We never got that far. But the last 40 acres we just marked out with a tractor that way, and the crew would.
So before I move on, you brought up the meetings at the Tigard Fire Hall in the early days and the sharing of knowledge. So tell me about what you remember from those meetings and from the people who were getting the Oregon wine industry off the ground. What were your memories of them? What were the meetings like? What was being done behind the scenes to help the industry?
The meeting I remember most, I think I'll start with that, and then maybe some of the other will come, was I can't remember the exact point of the discussion, but I took exception to something that was being proposed because I thought it either ignored the vineyard or maybe it wasn't good for the vineyard. So I spoke up. Well, later that night, it was nominations for the board of directors, and I got nominated and elected. So I learned, you better be careful what you say or you'll get a job. And money to do anything as an industry was always an issue. And I didn't know it at the time, but for the next 6 years, I got heavily involved in the dues structure of the organization. Because after a year or two, and it could have been just around this time that the Oregon Wine Growers Association, as the OWA was being formed. Prior to that, there was a North Willamette, and there were two groups. There was one in Southern Oregon and one in Northern Oregon, and somewhere along the line, we all met at, I think, Silver Falls State Park. And we met there one day and agreed to make one organization. That was kind of significant, and I think that time I wasn't on the board because there was no organization when I first started with the North Willamette. But then I did, a couple years later, I got elected to the OWA board, and I missed the first meeting. I think we went to Hawaii with Diane's parents. And it was in January. You know, you could sometimes sneak away in January, but you know, the rest of the year until harvest was over, it was pretty much, we were busy all the time. Well, when I came back and went to the second meeting, I discovered I was now treasurer of the Oregon Wine Growers Association. And I'm trying to remember, but I may have been treasurer for the North Willamette chapter, and someone said, well, I think someone said, well, Jack's not here, let's make him do it. So I became the treasurer, and I didn't have any, you know, accounting experience or bookkeeping experience or anything. I think there was probably some question about, you know, were we really legal, you know, the way we were doing things and so forth as an organization. But anyway, we carried on, and I think by the third year of, I can't remember if they were 2-year terms or 4-year terms. We kind of got to the breaking point where we needed to do something to raise some more money, and we had tried fundraisers. There was Summerfest at the Forestry Center in Portland. We had it at hotels. We sold things and so forth. And finally, and I don't know who said it. It may have been my idea. It may have been somebody else who says, you know, look, here are people with 50-acre vineyards and, you know, maybe 20,000-gallon wineries, and you're paying $75 a year to the organization, and then you wonder why there's no money. So it's time, you know. We're spending all this money, you know, driving around in hours and hours trying to raise money. Why don't we just write the check? You'll get him. It wasn't necessarily a popular idea because nobody was really making money. So, have you heard this before?
Not quite so well. Yes.
And so, well, I was a treasurer, so I was to put together a dues committee and to come up with a plan. So I did that. I took it very seriously. I found little vineyards, big vineyards, little wineries, big wineries from all over the state. There were maybe 8 of us. And we held meetings and hearings in every in every region of the state, and I think there were every chapter, and there were 4 or 5. I called everyone I knew. Oh, well, we came up with a proposal from those meetings, and we wrote our proposal because it needed to be voted on by the membership. I called everyone I knew and told them what the proposal was. I sent it to them, and we come to the day of the proposal, and I'm thinking, I think we're going to have a new due structure, and it was based upon if you were bigger, you paid more. The folks that had 2 acres, well, they weren't going to pay any more. But we were probably 60 acres at that time. So at least I felt we could certainly pay more. And the people who were making wine, who were the ones who needed most of the money for marketing, they could pay more. So we go to that day, we have the meeting, the proposal is made, and discussion is made, and I spoke for it, and one of the winemakers stood up and spoke against it, and we lost by 1 vote. And I was devastated. I think I still am. It was quite a blow, and also because people who were on the committee who had traveled around the state for like 6 months doing this also went along with the winery person who did this, and I had talked with him in days before the meeting, and he gave no indication that this was going to happen. The next year, my term was up on the board. The next year, essentially the same thing passed, and so. I don't know why was that. I've never quite understood about it. I've seen him a few times, and we've talked about that day, but we've never really talked about that day. So anyway, so if he ever watches, he'll know who he is. No, he'll remember that. There were other. We did other money things, but I don't remember where they are. And about this time, that would have been we're probably getting to the mid 80s, or maybe even past. But I think it may be 86. In the mid-'80s, somewhere, Hyland got another chance to be part of Schoolhouse. It turned out half of Schoolhouse was for sale, and Hyland and Durant Vineyards went together, and we each bought a quarter. And as part of that, we made grape contracts. That was, and one of the reasons we did this was we were having trouble finding markets. It was a roller coaster ride. You would go along for 5 years, and the demand for grapes was. You sold everything you had, and then you go into 5 years where you had to work, spend a lot of time, lean on your friends to buy some of your grapes and so forth. And this was one of those times, and we thought, if there's another vineyard out there that's interested, they're going to buy in just to have a market. So we were able to do it, and we could do it, and we had that history of they might have been partners earlier. We'd been selling grapes to them all along, so it was a thing to do. And so we owned for 10 years. We were partners for 10 years. And in the end, it didn't, I don't think it went, well, I know, it didn't go the way that either of us expected. And I think it was because just, we were a vineyard that owned part of a winery. And they were a winery that also had a vineyard. But it was a subtle difference, but it was just big enough that our goals didn't always come together. You know, my philosophy was that if there was $1 to be made in the winery, you know, maybe the grower should get 10 cents. No, we should, and I'm not sure that was the winery's attitude. So anyway, in about 10 years later, we sold our 50% back to the winery. Continued to sell grapes to them, but not nearly as many. And one thing about the grape sales, Hyland was a fairly large vineyard. There were a lot of wineries starting. You know, well, they kind of came in waves too, but and so there was always demand for fruit because a winery would plant grapes, start making wine, and they didn't have enough grapes, so we'd help them get started, and they would help us by buying our fruit.
Was there a certain winery that came along that you worked with?
Well, yes. Oh, and then if we ever did, you know, lose a winery, and sometimes when their fruit matured, they didn't need us anymore, and I hate to say, but there were a couple occasions where they didn't like our fruit, so we had to go find a new buyer. But almost always we found, I don't want to say something better, but financially it was almost always better, and maybe it was just the time. You know, maybe the new person coming in has to compete with the old timers, and there was some camaraderie or friendship with the old folks, and the new folks said, well, one way I can do this is if I can spend money, and so we would, the grape price would go up a little bit. I always thought to where it should have been in the first place. Anyway, but we almost always found new customers. I think there was only one year when we may have had 5 or 10 tons of Chardonnay. It was too much, and this was because we had planted too much Chardonnay, and we did that because at one time we had 3 sparkling wine customers. We sold to Argyle, Merriweather. They were a short-term winery, but we had hoped, you know, that they would do more. And then another guy in Seattle was making sparkling wine, and so, well, these folks are going to need grapes, and they want Chardonnay, so we better we better plant. Well, we eventually lost all 3 of those, and so we ended up way too much Chardonnay. We found other customers for most of it, and what we didn't, some of it we grafted, some of it we pulled the plants out and replanted.
Tell me about when phylloxera came to the valley.
I dug up the first plant with phylloxera on it, I do believe. Alan Holstein, who was a vineyard manager for Knutson and maybe Drew Ann at that time, and maybe somewhere else, Argyle. Had seen an aerial photo of this vineyard. Well, it was Sokolblasser vineyard. And I was, Sokolblasser had a new, their vineyard manager had left. And so the assistant who had been working there a while was taken over, but they felt he needed some backup, so they wanted to know if they hired me to come, I think, 2 days a week for a couple hours. And he was doing fine, he did fine. But Alan called me and said, I saw this photo, this aerial photo, and there's this small area with one dead plant in the middle and some around it. So we went and dug up the plant and looked at it, and well, there were these little critters on it. We put it in a black plastic bag. I called Oregon State, and they said, well, if we have people here who can make a positive identification you want. So I drove it to Corvallis, and by the end of the day, we had confirmed that there was phylloxera. And I said, what do I do with it now? And they said, well, we don't want it. And I said, well, it was like driving up the valley. I was worried that I was going to contaminate the whole state, so forth. I think I put it in a dumpster. So, got rid of it. And so then we started taking precautions, washing the totes before they left the vineyard. It wasn't really a joking matter, but I did joke about it, that I thought, rinsing off the bottom of the tote just wet down the phylloxera to keep it alive till it got to the next vineyard. But we did that, and this was about the time I think we were switching over to a lot of plastic bins, and they were much easier to wash and so forth. Old wooden totes were hard, a lot of repair, and then it started showing up here and there. When we sold Hyland in 2007, we had never found any indication. We had 2 experts come, one that we hired, and one that the buyer hired, and they wherever they wanted, and they dug wherever they wanted, and we never found any. And I don't know what it is now. But hopefully they got a long time before it was a problem. But we did start planting. The last 20 acres, maybe, were on rootstock.
So tell me about you mentioned obviously that for you you kind of came into grapes by accident. Tell me about your own personal interest in wine and how it grew or if it grew during the time you were working with grapes.
Well, it did. I think I kind of fell in love with Pinot Noir. And I had Pinot Noir every day for how many years? 25 years, 30 years, 40 years? Who knows? But not so much anymore. I think, it's too much of a good thing, I think so. So I still, drink wine and so forth, but not as much Pinot. The reds, maybe it's getting old or something. The reds just don't agree with me too much. But I have a winemaker friend who likes Pinot, but his wife doesn't, and we've been friends off and on since forever, and probably more so recently, and so when we go out to dinner, if he goes out with his wife, he doesn't usually order a bottle of Pinot because, no, you can't drink the whole bottle yourself, But if I'm along, then he gets to do that, and so I've enjoyed a lot of Pinots with him. And I was thinking about the original owners of Hyland, and I think they had some interest in wine, but I don't know that none of them felt like, I want to make wine. I don't think. They thought that, well, we have a vineyard, we should have a winery. It would be nice to do. And I think they liked it as owners, but not so much as the actual doing it. Although in the beginning, those first 3 years, they worked weekends. In the early days, there was no gravel road up to the vineyard. It was dirt, and so when it rained, they couldn't get up, and they would drive out from Portland on Friday night, and in the early spring and fall, well, they get to the vineyard at dark. And they would carry their things up the hill. And they each had a small travel trailer on their various areas scattered around the vineyard. And no phone, no electricity, no water. I can see going up the hill, maybe carrying your food for a couple of days, but carrying your water for a couple of days. So I think they made multiple trips, and it was half a mile up this muddy trail to get started. I don't know how long that lasted, but at least it made a good story. But there, I know Dick Markley, one of the partners, belonged to a wine club in Portland. I think they met out west somewhere, Hillsboro maybe. And he took us one night, and it was a buying club. But I remember that most of what he brought home were German wines. So I think Dick was very much interested in German wines. And Victor Kreimeier was German, and so he was, he had kind of interest in Germany. And I remember in the early days, they're talking about having visited Germany, but I don't think any of them had gone to France. And so they took care of the German varieties, and I did the French ones. So. And I think their involvement, in part, was maybe financial. It was an investment. There were tax benefits to investing in an operation like this. they had all had successful careers. I was trying to remember how they all got together, which I think was kind of an interesting story. And I'm not sure I have it all, but I'll give you a little bit. There were four families: Welch, Markley, Kreimeier, and Smith. Smith and Kreimeier were both foresters. They worked for the U.S. Forest Service. Bill Welch had a degree in some wood product, something from Oregon State. So he had a connection there. Dick and Lita Markley were ophthalmologists, and they shared a surgery in Portland. But Dick was a bit of an adventurer, and the Forest Service used to have VIPs visit. I think Vic said they came from Washington, and they would take them on overnight trail rides to places. And I don't know what this policy came from. It was a Forest Service policy, or it was dictated to them by the people who visited. But if they went out overnight, they needed a doctor along with them. I don't know, maybe they were all old. I don't really know. Well, I mean, Dick thought, oh, I get to go ride on horseback and go out and camp in the woods with these people. This would be a neat thing. So he signed on as the doctor.
As an ophthalmologist.
Yeah. Well, I think he had a medical degree, and then he specialized. I think that's how it works. But anyway, and so when it came time to buy land and start a vineyard, Kreimeier, Smith, and Markley knew each other. They had some past together, and how Welch got connected with them, I'm not sure. But when those first years, I think Bill retired first and built a house maybe after 5 years, and Victor Kreimeier after 10 years, and Dick worked a long time, maybe another 20 years before he retired. And I think by the time you started the project, I think they had all died by 2011, and their spouses.
So you had the job, you worked for them for 30 years, more than 30 years. How did your work change? How did the job change? How did everything change for you from the early days through to the sale?
Well, I started pruning grapes by myself in 1976, and we were a corporation, and I was president of the company when we sold in 2007. And along the way, I remember the first summer, Bill Welch came to me and said, I'm not sure if we need more help or not. And he said, it's obvious you're thinking about the vineyard, so if you think you need some more help, just go hire them. So, and I'd been there about 6 months, so we did that. The next year and I think they gave me a little raise. And it wasn't much, but it was something. And the next year, they decided that I needed some more incentive, so we did something. I forget what it was to do this, and only after a couple of years, I met a guy who came from California. He had spent 20 years developing a vineyard in Mendocino County. And when he started working there, the folks had a small child, a toddler. Well, when the toddler got out of college, they came home and they took his job. And so, he essentially, he was done after 20 years. So I got to thinking about that. He was pretty bitter about that whole thing. So I said, what can I do? Well, I'll ask to become a partner. And so I did. And they took me up on it and actually gave me a better offer than what I proposed. And so after 15 or 20 years, I became an equal partner with them. So there wasn't in terms of that part of the vineyard, and how the job changed was from doing all of the pruning in the early years to doing virtually none of it the last 5 years, 10 years. We had probably for the first 10 or 15 years, I was out there, all day, every day with wherever I needed to be. And then as the vineyard just got too big, and I eventually was on the board of directors of Sokol Blosser. So there were other things to do. There were some years there were a lot of grapes to sell and so forth. And I got older. It was hard to be out there in the cold and rain and wet every day. And then about the last 10 years, we had we had that first period where I did that. And then the middle years were, I guess I call the contract years. And then the last 10 years, we went back to employing everyone directly, but we had a really good supervisor. He knew what he was doing. He knew the people. He spoke the language. He was really good. And if we needed to hire more people, he knew. He'd put out the word, and they'd come and apply, and it was really good. And things went much more smoothly the last year. So it only took us 20 some years to kind of to get it going. So
the others have retired by then too.
Well, yes, and actually I think Bill Welch maybe even died before the last 10 years.
So tell me about, you mentioned you're the president of the company by the time it sells. So tell me about that process, the decision to sell, and then the process of finding a buyer and going through it.
Well, I think the decision to sell was mine. No one, by the time we sold, Victor Kreimeier was still one of the original owners, but the other two families, their children owned it, and neither of the children or their children were interested. They were interested as absentee owners. Two of the partners lived in Washington and one lived in Colorado. So they had moved on. And so maybe 19 or 2000, the early 2000s, we started thinking about it. Diane pointed out to me one year that what the cost of medical insurance would be until the time I could get Medicare, and we decided maybe we'd wait a few years before we sold the vineyard. And we went on, and then I was all ready to propose it at a meeting, and that year one of the partners died suddenly in an accident, or the result of an accident. And I didn't think it was fair to talk about that at that time. So we postponed it another year, or maybe two. And then we finally got together, and I proposed it, and we talked about selling the vineyard and doing something else as a group with the money. And one of the partners said, well, we worked as a vineyard, but that doesn't mean we'll work as something else. So, that was not a good idea. And they said if I didn't want to do it anymore, they didn't want to do it either. So it was a fairly emotional thing to do. So we decided on an approach, and we found an agent close by who we worked with for a couple years. We'd get 3 or 4 people who come and take a look each year, and nothing happened. And then finally we got another agent. We didn't get any more people to come to look, and we really weren't making any progress. But in 2007, it was a year of big demand for grapes. I would get calls out of the blue. I got calls from people I didn't know, wanting to know if we had any Pinot Noir. And I got a call from Laurent Montelieu. Jack, do you have any Pinot for me? I said, well, yes. Well, I think I phrased it, no, but I have a vineyard for you. And he laughed. He called me back a couple of weeks later. Said, what do you have in mind? And I told him. He said, I'll come and take a look. And he had a partner there, I think, in Northwest Wine Company. And so the two of them came out. They looked it over. And, well, they decided that for what we were asking, they just couldn't do it. I think I can talk about this. Yeah. And so that went on. And then we had another meeting, and we got to talking about, well, maybe there's a way we can structure the sale we were a corporation. And so rather than sell the assets, which we thought we were going to do, we'll sell the stock. And there were huge tax advantages to selling the stock, which meant we could lower the price. And to the buyer, I think it was up to them to decide. And so I called them back and said, would you be interested in the stock sale? Well, we'll think about that. So we got together, we agreed on the price, and worked it out. And it only took like 6 weeks or something like that. But it was a very intense 6 weeks. The partners were spread out all over the place. We did it all by fax and whatever kind of signature it is that you do like that. And we talked about my staying on for the rest of the year. And it turned out that we didn't come to terms on that. They hired my friend Joel Meyer to to manage the vineyards, and so I knew that he would do a good job, and so forth. And we left the vineyard. Yes, we got the payment one day. I had one more day. I was obligated, and I went and I drove around with the new owners for a couple hours and drove away, and I didn't go back for maybe 8 years. Hyland Wine, when they were starting Hyland Winery here in Dundee, they called and asked if we had old photos. They wanted like some photos, so we gave them what we had, and that's why I went up. The vineyard looked good. It was much bigger than we left. I was a little worried because we sold in 2007, and then 2008 happened, and I think it was not a good time. But they were prepared. They were in the wine business, and come whatever happened, this is what we're going to do, and they just went on. So there were lots of new vineyards, and the vineyards were there, looked really good. In some cases better, I thought, than maybe when we left it. So it was very satisfying. And then I haven't been back since. I thought maybe I would consult. Then I got to thinking about, it's almost a whole new thing now in 2007. There are people coming in with degrees in viticulture. Not that there weren't, in the past there were people doing that, but there's just a lot more. People just know a lot more, and I'm tired. And so we moved on, and we still had our 30 acres on the hill near there, and we had an old house that I had promised to remodel, 30 years earlier, that wasn't quite done yet. So we worked some more on that, and we traveled, did some traveling. And then in 2013 we moved to Newburgh. We decided we didn't need 30 acres anymore or a house, and we found this place. When we sold the vineyard, I joined the McMinnville Senior Men's Golf Tour, and we played Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings. Monday here at Chehalem Glen in Newburgh, and Dallas on Wednesday, and McMinnville on Friday. And so that's kind of what I did. And then after 4 or 5 years, the person who was the president he didn't want to do it anymore. And at that time, they didn't elect a president. There were some of the old timers in the club would just get together and try to find out who was interested. Well, one guy approached me one day, and I think they did it because they didn't want someone else to do it. So they asked me if I would be interested. And I said, oh, gee, why do I want to do this kind of thing again? Well, I ended up being the president for 4 years, and kind of restructured the thing so that when I left, we elected a board of directors, and one of the board of directors was made the president for a year, and they went on to do that, and then they went on to rewrite the bylaws and so forth. And I played with them up until a couple years ago. So that was kind of fun.
What's your handicap?
It's not. I don't have one anymore because I didn't sign up this year, so I don't have to say. We decided, shortly after we sold the vineyard, within a couple of years, that we wanted to get away for the winter. We tried California, Arizona, Texas, Mexico. For one reason or another, we didn't like any of them, so we went back to Hawaii. And we now spend about half the year in Hawaii and half the year here. And Diane has developed new interest, and mine is a bird count. There's a bird in Hawaii called kolea, or Pacific golden plover. It's a small, it's a shorebird. Is it shorebird? Yeah, I think it's a shorebird. It migrates to Alaska during breeding season. So in April it flies to Alaska, comes back in, the adults come back in August, September, and the young come back a little later. And so from December through March, we count them to see. The idea is how many there are on Hawaii. And so next year will be the 6th year of a 5-year project. So we're just going to keep on going. And with GPS and new technology and AI and all that, we're developing new ways to report, and so it's easier for the counter, and it's easier for the people who are getting the data, so we can figure out how many of these birds are in the Hawaiian Islands. So I guess it's, you need a reason to get up in the morning. So
that's a cool one. I like that. That's excellent. All right, a couple questions to kind of wrap things up. I'm curious, first of all, obviously you saw pretty much all of the growth of Oregon wine up until the most recent few years here. Tell me about the biggest changes you saw in terms of the industry. What were, in addition to it just growing in size, what changed about the Oregon wine industry in your time in it? And as you were leaving, how did it look differently than when you started?
Well, it was probably less personal as it got bigger. Although there still were groups that got together. Every Monday morning for the last probably 15 years that we owned the vineyard, I got together with 4 other growers and a winemaker, and we played golf at a couple places down south. And we thought it was neat that everybody gets up and goes to work on Monday morning, and we got up and went and played golf. Usually because we work half the weekend or more to get going. So there still was personal things.
We don't know everybody anymore. It used to be that we knew everybody.
Well, that's true. Yeah. Well, we don't know now. But even when we left, we probably didn't know. You said earlier there were 39,000 people. Well, when Hyland was started, there might have been 39. There just wasn't. A few more when I came along. The wines got better. We got better at growing grapes. And I think as we got better growing grapes, the weather got warmer. That helped those of us who had cooler sites. There were actually people told us in the early days that we were probably too cold to grow Pinot Noir, and others thought, no, that you're just right. And so all it took was just wait a little bit, and it got better. But I also think we learned to manage the canopies better. Winemakers learned how to deal with issues that they had. People started to make a little money, not a lot. I can't speak for the wineries, but the vineyard was much like a farm. That people would farm all their lives, and they made their money when they sold the farm. Well, that's what we did. The original Hyland partners never took a penny out in those almost 35 years, 40 years that they owned it. It was just having it was, their reward. I don't know that that's what they started out to do, but that's what they ended up doing. But they were, or their children were rewarded in the end. But I would have to think about, just, gosh, how it has changed. The industry organizations have changed. We started out as these little groups throughout the state, and then they became the one in the OWA, and then the Wine Advisory Board was started, which provided more funding because of the grape tax and the wine tax. And then eventually the two are formed into one, and I'm not quite sure what it is now. I remember having a complaint about how they changed the dues then, so I guess I was destined to always have issues with the dues. So, but I don't actually remember how that was. And so I think today now there's a board appointed by the governor. And they decide how the money that's the taxes that the vineyards and the wineries pay is spent. And I'm sure it's huge compared to what it was in the early days. $100 bottles of wine, common, versus $5 bottles of wine. I ran across a photo the other day. I had a 1976 Erath Pinot and I don't know where I acquired it. Someone may have given it to me. It was purchased in Eugene for $6.50. Oh, but I have to tell you about 1983.
Okay.
Which was another milestone. We are 1974 planting of Pinot Noir. This would have been the Coury selection, and I'm sure I know you've talked with Chuck Coury and Joel Meyer, so they took care of all that. And we picked the grapes and we sold them to Sokolblasser. But we also sold some of the grapes to Howison Winery, that's now Chehalem, I think, and to Yamhill Valley Vineyards. So I don't know how much, but all the grapes went to Sokolblasser. Bob McRitchie made the wine. Someone entered the wine in a competition with the French, and I'm sure you've heard that story. But anyway,
Stephen Carey.
Yeah.
And Myron Redford.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The wine won. Well, those were our grapes in the wine. And so that was nice, even though, the winery gets more credit, the grower not so much. But anyway, that was fine. But in the fall at the Oregon State Fair in 1985, that wine won Best of Show. And prior to that, the winery got the governor's trophy for the best wine of the show. If the grapes came from a grower that wasn't affiliated with a winery, there was no award. Well, a year or two before that, I was on the OWA board, and one of the people proposed one day that there be an award for the grower if it was different than the winery, and that their winery would sponsor this trophy this award that would be given to the grower. So we discussed it, we voted on it, and I was the only one to vote no. I thought there should be an award for the grower, but I thought it should come from the industry rather than, because it was a PR move for the winery. Well, and we won the trophy for that wine, even though I had voted against it. And so I'm going to give, you can see on the, I won't mention the name of the winery right there, but you can see who it was. So I'm going to, if you would like to have this for your, we'll pass that along to you.
I would love to have that in the archives. That's incredible.
And under there in an envelope is a little note about the OWA story about how I didn't vote in my own best interest or something like that. So
that is amazing.
Don't photograph right now because the top comes off. So it's a dodgy photo.
We'll get some super glue.
When we picked the grapes that year, we knew they were different. We didn't know that they were special, but there was. They were loose clusters. They weren't very big. I think there was just something about the look of them. They just and when we picked them, they were done. They were ready to be picked. I think we happened to pick them at the right time. Bob McRitchie said, I put the grapes in the tank and they started fermenting and they finished in record time. I didn't do a thing, and it turned out so. It made great story to remember 40 years later, 45 years later. So that was our one wine claim to fame, I think. We sold grapes to, I think, 50 wineries over the 30 years. At one time, we had 20 in 1 year, which turned out to be too many. But you didn't want to have too few in case you lost one, and it was if you lost a 10 or 20 ton winery, well, that was okay. But if you lost somebody you were selling 100 tons to, it was really hard.
I'm curious about sort of the last question for you to kind of wrap things up. Your sort of relationship with or perspective on the industry since you've retired. Obviously, you're not in it every day. You're not paying as close attention. What have you seen? And as you see what the industry's become, how does it make you feel? How do you reflect upon what this industry has grown into?
Yeah, I think when I left, I just left, and I really don't. I've thought about it probably more in the last 2 weeks than I have in the last 20 years.
Could you have ever foreseen it becoming what it's become?
No, I don't think I would have expected. I have just some little things that I've noticed or I've encountered. A few years ago, there was we heard some local politicians talking. We went to their talk, and one of them said it was about the importance of supporting the Oregon wine industry, and which kind of caught me by surprise that, you know, it's grown so much. And I said, well, you know, I thought it was well on its way. You know, does it really need does it really need you know, local politicians' help? And then I recently met one of our old customers, wineries that I hadn't seen for 20 years, and I was surprised to learn that there are a lot of wineries for sale. So yeah, maybe it does. So, you know, things change, but they kind of stay the same. About every 10 years, the Oregon Wine Growers Association would get together and say, hey, we've got to do something. You know, things are not going very well. And so we would, you know, everybody would get busy and do something. So it may be like that, and maybe that's just life. I don't know. They come and go, but I don't really have any specific things. The people that we associate with that were in the business, you know, have left years ago, and so we don't talk about it. Oh, once in a while we'll mention it. When I left the OWA board, the new person that came in and became the treasurer was a CPA. He was the real thing, and we became friends, and we still are. They live in Salem, and Diane sees his wife at least once a month. They're in the same book group, and so on. And I would like to add one thing. Diane was a part of this. First of all, putting up with me doing this for the first 15 years, and the second 15 years, she became the secretary treasurer of the organization. So, and then as the partners moved away, why she became a bigger part of it. Not no tractor driving or pruning or any of that kind of stuff, but took care of all the rest of it.
The warm inside.
Mm-hmm. And if I could just look at my notes once, see if I missed anything that was very important.
Did we miss anything?
I think there was one thing I wanted to say was from the very beginning, the partners talked about a winery. And then when they didn't start one on their own, and they bought into Sokolblasser, and then when they sold that, I think that kind of took care of that. But they did get their winery after all, with Hyland Estates Winery on the other end of Dundee. I think, I'm not sure any of them, well, I know two of them never, they had died by then. Vic may have been still around, but I doubt that he ever visited. But, they'd all approve of the winery. So they got their way in the end.
Well, that's all the questions that I have. Anything else we need to cover while we have you here today? Anything we didn't talk about?
No, I think we talked about most things. I don't remember what I said most of it, so.
I assure you it was wonderful and also very funny. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us today. Thank you for sharing your stories with us and having such great notes and props ready for us. We appreciate that. And we'll go ahead and let you off the hook. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.